Hey guys, good morning. It's Mr. Webker here again. I am back at Starbucks, as you can tell. Today we are going to go over 17.3, um, which is about the war in Vietnam, and then we're also going to go over the ideas of communism spreading throughout um, the world, including Asia and South America. So remember to highlight your answers in your PowerPoint check on your notes. Make sure that's in there because I will be giving points based on that. If you have any questions, feel free to remind me, and I will get back to you as soon as possible. So, a little bit about Vietnam. Vietnam was controlled by the French since the early 1900s, but during World War II, Vietnam was taken over by the Japanese. And so, after the Japanese left, a man by the name of Ho Chi Minh uh, basically decided to demand freedom for Vietnam. And Ho Chi Minh was a communist, and so after World War II, the United States supported France as they tried to take back Vietnam because the United States did not want Vietnam to fall into the hands of the communists. So after World War II, uh, the Viet Cong, as they are come to known, uh, are a group of soldiers that are ran by Ho Chi Minh, and basically what they do is they take the power from France by using a thing called guerrilla warfare, where basically they fight in the streets, they don't wear uniforms, and anybody who is deemed as a threat is killed or tortured by the Ho Chi Minh. Um, the United States is afraid of this because we were believing an idea known as domino theory, and it's the idea is that if you could imagine a set of dominoes, when you tip one over, they all fall over. Um, we were afraid that if Vietnam fell to communism, then the rest of Asia, like dominoes, would fall to communism. We already saw it in Korea, and now we saw it happening in Vietnam and China, and so we were afraid that this would continue and all of Asia would become communist. Um, and so, basically, the communists had taken all of North Vietnam for their control, but they were still fighting in South Vietnam um, against people who did not want communism until the U.S. entered the Vietnam War on the side of South Vietnam, which was non-communist, and basically we supported the South Vietnamese while China and the Soviet Union, which are both communist countries, supported North Vietnam. So, in order to enter the war, President Nixon in 1964 had to find a way to make Congress approve of him going to war. And so he told um, the Congress that the United States had ships attacked by the Vietnamese off the coast of Vietnam. It's still unsure whether or not that actually happened, or if we just got close to the coast and then we said we were fired on, and then we went to war. Nobody really knows. A lot of people think that that was a lie and made up. But either way, Congress approved of going to war after our ships were attacked by the Vietnamese, and so we entered the war. The problem is our soldiers had never fought in a jungle before. We had never fought a battle like Vietnam. So when we went to Vietnam, we tried to fight against the Vietnamese people. They knew a lot more about their terrain than we did, and so our ground game, or our ability to fight on the ground, was very weak, and we were losing the war. So the United States began to use airplanes to attack the Vietnamese. And what we would do is we'd fly over. We would drop either a gas that would cause the leaves on the trees to fall off, or we would drop like fire bombs called napalm, which would basically light the whole land on fire and burn out people who are hiding in the wilderness. The problem with this, though, is it was very deadly and it destroyed the farmland in Vietnam. Most people in Vietnam make money by raising rice and grain, and so when you destroy the farmland, you cause them to starve, and you cause them to lose their money, and so most Vietnamese did not like the United States in Vietnam, which would lead to about 1.5 million Vietnamese and 58,000 U.S. soldiers dying um, in the war. So not only did nobody like that we were there, but there were a ton of casualties, which would later come to cause the United States to to be disliked in Vietnam. So about 5 years into the war, there were large protests in the United States, which basically wanted to end the war in Vietnam. This was during the 60s, which had a lot of protest movements, anyways. And so the Vietnamese War became something to protest in the United States. Um, and so, because of the protests, we slowly began to take out troops in Vietnam to help support the South Vietnamese fight against the uh, the communists, but we were not successful in doing this. Our plan was called Vietnamization or Vietnamization, which basically meant that we were going to let the Vietnamese slowly take over their own country, um, and we will withdraw troops because Americans did not want our troops in war. The problem with that is that it didn't work. So we started this in 1969, but by 1973, all communists had taken over Vietnam. And then after this, the communists spread into Cambodia in 1975, where the Khmer Rouge, as they were called, which were basically sort of like the Viet Cong, were able to take over Cambodia, and in doing so, killed millions of citizens, causing a genocide unlike any seen in Asia before. So, although the majority of our focus in this chapter is on wars in Asia like Vietnam and Korea, there were also fights for communism throughout the world, in Latin America, in parts of Europe, in Asia, in Africa. And so, we are going to briefly go over some of the other struggles throughout the world and explain what the U.S. did to try and stop the spread of communism throughout not only Asia, Africa, but also Latin America and really the rest of the world. So basically, there were three worlds, as you would say. The first world, which was seen as people who were a part of sort of the United States democratic policies. There was the second which was connected to Russian policies and communist policies, and then there was the third world, which were people who did not want to be a part of either, and both sides were trying to convert them to their side, either to be a first world country or a second world country. Um, and so in this fight between communism and capitalism, both sides use many different strategies to help take over these countries. So often, if there was a leader that one side did not like, we would use assassination to make sure they didn't get control. Both the CIA, which is the American Central Intelligence Agency, which is basically our secret service around the world, and the KGB, which is the same thing for Russia, would assassinate people they felt would not support them. Further, there were wars throughout the world that we would either fund or be actively a part of, like Vietnam, Korea, wars in Iran, where we would support people in order to make sure that we either saw no communism there, or if the Russians wanted communism there, they would fund it. For example, in Afghanistan, there was a war to for communism. The United States backed a group of people known as Al Qaeda because they did not like the communists. That would later bite us in the butt because those same people used the money we gave them to fight communism to fight us because they did not like America as well. Um, and this happened over and over again. And another way that we did it is we would build resources in those countries to make them like us. So we would build schools, hospitals, colleges, whatever was necessary to help them understand that we were there for them, and to hopefully prevent them from converting to communism, or for the Russian side for them to convert to capitalism. So both sides did this. So as I said earlier, the world was really divided into three. So there was the first world, which were people who were anti-communism, like the United States, Canada, Western Europe, Australia, you name it. And so they did not support what was happening in the communist areas. They were aligned with the United States. The second world were countries aligned with Russia and the Communist Party. And so that would be places like China, Eastern Europe, obviously Russia, Mongolia, areas like that. And then there's the third world. These countries were not a part of either side, and many wanted to stay neutral. Like India and Indonesia said that they do not want either, that actually they supported a mixture of both, and they were not going to take one side or the other. In Latin America, communism spread actually pretty rapidly throughout uh, South and Central America, and so the United States really wanted to end communist control in that area. But some leaders that we see in communist countries in Latin America are found in Cuba, and we'll talk later in Honduras. But in Cuba, um, Cuba has been controlled by communists since the about 1940s. Fidel Castro is a communist-backed lawyer in Cuba, so he was a lawyer, and then the communists paid him to become a leader or try to become a leader of Cuba. He made Cuba rich at first by taking over farms, but as always, Cuba communist countries do not keep their wealth long, so he actually ended up in extreme poverty. Um, and anybody who disagreed with him was either put in prison or killed. He had total control of his country, and so a government where somebody has total control, it's called a totalitarianism. It's called totalitarianism when one man has total control, and so he ran his country as a totalitarian state. So America did not want a communist country so close to them. Cuba is literally like across the ocean from them. It's a super close boat ride from Cuba to Florida. Um, and so the U.S. did not want to actually get involved. So what we did is we offered to train Cubans who have come to America to fight against Fidel Castro. And so we trained them, and then we sent them to a place called the Bay of Pigs, and we said that, hey, if you go there and start to fight, we will send air support, which means we'll send airplanes that drop bombs. Um, and so they land on the Bay of Pigs and they invade Cuba, and the United States, realizing that if they sent airplanes, that would be an act of war based on or from the United States, refuse to send those airplanes. So basically, we let all these Cuban immigrants die on the beaches of the Bay of Pigs, and the Castro beats them and says, "Hey, look, I'm so good that I beat the Americans," and so that allows his power to spread through Cuba. He ends up becoming the dictator of Cuba, and this proves that the United States can't even stop communism in the country closest to them. So if they can't stop communism there, how does the world know that they can stop communism anywhere? So once Cuba became communist, the Russians had a great idea. See, America had put nuclear bombs in Turkey, which is an ally of the United States, and right across a little teeny tiny lake from Russia. And so the Russians said, oh, well, if the Americans can do that, then we can do this. And so what they did is when Cuba became communist, they took nuclear missiles and they put them on Cuba. And that scared the United States. As you can see in this map, it is very close between Cuba and just about every major country in the United States. And so Americans were afraid that this would cause an explosion of war. And so this came to be known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the United States had to make sure that the missiles in Cuba were not launched on the United States. So as I said on the last slide, the Soviet Union said that they would expand power by putting missiles in Cuba, an already communist country. And what they went to say is that if any Latin American country wants to convert to communism, we will keep these missiles here, so that way when you convert, the United States can't fight against you because they know we will launch these missiles. This causes a huge tension between the two nations because both of them are afraid um, that the other will strike uh, with missiles. And so this creates something called the Cuban Missile Crisis, which we watched a video on earlier, and you guys will do work on this week. And so both sides begin to fight over how do we get rid of these missiles. This lasts for about 2 weeks, and so what they come to agree on is that if the U.S. promises to never invade Cuba, the Soviet Union will never or will remove those missiles. We also removed some of our missiles from Turkey, and so this created stability and peace again in the world. So up until the 1990s, the United States backed people fighting communism in South America. Communist revolutions were pretty common in South America, in Nicaragua and El Salvador. We see two of the biggest communist revolutions. Actually, the picture above me is a picture from the Nicaraguan Revolution. It was a poster to get farm workers to rise up against the non-communists to become communists. And so in Nicaragua, civil war really lasted up until the 1990s, and the United States backed and fought against the communists that whole time. Communism also tried to spread to the Middle East, but was not very successful in doing so. And so, in order to stop the spread of communism in the Middle East, the United States funded or gave money to Islamic extremist forces like the Taliban in order to stop the spread of communism. The problem with that is that they were actually anti-America too. So when we gave them money, they later used that money in the 2000s to fight um, Islamic revolutions against the United States, as we see going on today in the Middle East.